Throughout human history, the outcome of wars has always been decided not just through armies and tactics, but tariffs and coin. The Napoleonic Wars were no exception to this. The continental blockade was Napoleon's attempt to deprive Britain of vital European trade. From 1806 onwards, Napoleon enacted a boycott of British goods within the French Empire. He also made cessation of trade with Britain a condition of treaties he signed with other European powers, which spread this self-blockade to most of Europe. The blockade was a major contributing factor behind Napoleon's first defeat and exile to Elba in 1814, as it irreparably soured relations with those powers. Join us as we jump into the dynamic geopolitics of the Napoleonic Wars and explore the policy that turned the tide against Napoleon Bonaparte. This video is brought to you by Napoleon Souvenirs. Whether you're a die-hard admirer of Napoleon or just a history buff on the hunt for something unique, Napoleon Souvenirs has got you covered. Head over to napoleonsouvenirs.com, link in the description, for a treasure trove of gifts and collectibles inspired by the Napoleonic era. From elegant stationery to historical miniatures to books, games, and even authentic replicas of Napoleonic weaponry, you'll find the perfect piece of history. And of course, no collection is complete without the iconic hat. Want to give your decor the imperial treatment? Right now you can grab any souvenirs, including an imperial eagle, at up to 20% off. Just use voucher code IMPERIAL for 20% off any product. Trust me, your battle standards will never look better. New sales are popping up all the time, so make sure to check out the full selection at napoleonsouvenirs.com. You're guaranteed to find that special something, whether it's for a fellow history lover or just a treat for yourself. And if you're in Paris, swing by their physical store near the Jardin du Palais Royal for the true Napoleon souvenir experience, right at the source. Click the link in the description, explore the world of Napoleon souvenirs, and take home a piece of history today. If Russia makes a serious effort to stop the trade in colonial goods, England will make peace before the year is out. Napoleon made this prediction in a letter to his Foreign Affairs Minister, Monsieur de Champagny, in November 1810, 4 long years after commencing his continental blockade of Britain. The equal measures of frustration and optimism that bleed through the page encapsulate the blockade. It was an ambitious strategy that was ultimately curtailed by failures in diplomacy. At the time this letter was penned, Napoleon held most of Europe in an iron grip. So why was he so fixated on Britain? Despite its small size and equally diminutive land army, Britain used its deep coffers to fund France's enemies and frustrate Napoleon's designs on total European domination. The source of Britain's wealth was overseas trade, so a trade embargo would financially cripple Britain and deprive Napoleon's continental adversaries of much-needed monetary assistance. Britain owed its security to the fearsome Royal Navy, which protected its shores from French invasion. Its only weakness was its reliance on imports from the Baltic. Hemp, a plant used in the manufacture of rope, was sourced from Russia. Tar, necessary to prevent leaks, was imported from Sweden, and oaks for planks was imported from Poland. France had emphatically failed to sink the Royal Navy at Trafalgar, and so sought to starve it of supplies instead. The continental blockade was not an isolated attempt to hamstring the British economy, but an escalation in an ongoing trade war that ran parallel to the military actions of the Wars of the Coalition. From the beginning of the conflict in 1793, the Royal Navy was engaged in economic warfare against France. The British government issued the Instructions of 1793 in June of that year, which authorised privateers to intercept grain ships bound for France. In retaliation, the French government banned the import of British goods, threatening merchants in contravention of this law with 20 years in prison. The summer of 1794 saw a failed British attempt to intercept a transatlantic grain convoy bound for the French port of Brest. The following year, the Royal Navy enacted a blockade of that same port that would last for almost 2 decades, whilst diligently allocating vessels to guard their own convoys. The 13 years of blockade and counter-blockade between the two powers fueled Napoleon's belief that the measures he enacted on the continent were mere acts of reprisal, as the Emperor put it to his Foreign Affairs Minister in another 1810 letter. To his mind, the continental blockade was a necessary escalation in a sporadic trade war, rather than a new angle of attack. As well as providing Napoleon with a personal justification for the continental blockade, the preceding 13 years of economic warfare taught him that the Royal Navy could not be bested directly. In 1805, the Royal Navy numbered 807 ships strong, approximately double the strength of the French Imperial Navy at that time. Furthermore, French seamanship was a little inferior to that of the British. They were not a seafaring nation in the same way, and thus could not rely on pressing experienced sailors from merchant vessels and seaside towns in times of crisis, as the British did. Additionally, the suppression of officer schools under the French Revolution affected the number of officers who entered the French Imperial Navy well into the 19th century. This combination of factors meant that Napoleon had to play to France's strengths to wage effective economic warfare instead of matching the blockading tactics of the British. Capitalizing on his hard-won hegemony on the continent, Napoleon enacted the Berlin Decree in November 1806. This prohibited the French Empire and its allies from trading with Britain. This embargo was extended to neutral colonies with the Milan Decrees of November and December 1807. It must be noted that Britain enacted similar measures at this time. Orders in Council of January and November 1807 prohibited trade with France and its allies, and then extended the ban to neutrals. An order that followed a couple of years later, in 1809, decriminalized neutral trade in line with international law. The coverage of Napoleon's blockade was significant. The French Empire was vast and contained several client kingdoms. Napoleon's older brother Joseph ruled over Spain, albeit tumultuously, from November 1808. The emperor controlled the collection of northern territories that made up the Kingdom of Italy and the Kingdom of Naples in the south, where he eventually installed his brother-in-law Joachim Murat as king. Holland was ruled over by his younger brother Louis. Further east was the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of client states formed out of the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire. In addition, Napoleon amassed several hard-won allies through military conquest. Austria was bested at Austerlitz in 1805. Prussia and Russia then joined the blockade in July 1807 as a condition of the Treaty of Tilsit. The conglomerate kingdom of Denmark-Norway allied itself with France and thus joined the blockade in October 1807 as a response to Britain's brutal bombardment of Copenhagen in September. In 1810, Marshal Bernadotte was installed as Crown Prince of Sweden, giving Napoleon yet more influence in the Baltic. The continental blockade saw some initial success. The British economy was affected, and the value of the pound dropped by 30% in the blockade's initial months. The supply of crucial materials to the Royal Navy was challenged by the implementation of the blockade in the Baltic, and from the spring of 1807 until the end of 1808, their supply of hemp ran desperately low. Britain was able to import over £600,000 worth of hemp in 1807, but barely a third of that the following year. The prohibition of British products also created the opportunity for those goods to be manufactured domestically. Colonially produced sugarcane was out, and French-produced beet sugar was in, proposed to French farmers in 1811. The odd innovation here and there didn't equate to growth across the totality of French industry. The expected boom in domestic productivity didn't quite materialize, and France proved a poor substitute for British trade on the continent. This was one of the key factors behind the gradual collapse of the blockade. Russia and Britain had been conducting mutually profitable trade for decades before Russia was forced to put the relationship on hold by the Treaty of Tilsit. In 1802, the value of trade between Russia and Britain was 41.5 times greater than its trade with France. It profited a great deal from the Royal Navy's need for victuals and shipbuilding materials. The French Imperial Navy was much smaller and thus could not satisfy the same export demand placed on it by Russian manufacturers. Consequently, Russia faced a stark economic downturn. The ruble was plummeting in value, and all of this was because Russia was being wielded as a cudgel against Britain. The Russian government's response to this was to turn a blind eye to British smuggling. This tacit approval of smuggling became more blatant over the course of Russia's alliance with France. In effect, they were testing the limits of their diplomatic ties to France to see what they could get away with, whilst feigning earnest cooperation to Napoleon's face. In November 1810, Napoleon complained to his foreign minister that the Russian ambassador said one thing and did another. The ambassador provided assurances that Tsar Alexander was resolute in upholding the blockade, but Russian policy has hitherto followed a directly opposite line. That year, Russia conducted over £9 million worth of illicit trade with Britain. Moreover, Russia introduced aggressive tariffs on French imports, further limiting trade between the supposed allies. Holland too faced an economic downturn due to its involvement in the blockade, and likewise responded by ignoring smuggling. Dutch merchants were muscled out of long-established trade markets by France. Punishing tariffs were placed on Dutch goods, which rendered them uncompetitive in the European market. Most notably, wine, hops and soap were rejected by France in favour of domestic produce to grow French industry. This soft ban on Dutch produce culminated in French ports being closed off to Dutch ships altogether in November 1808. Dutch exports had been comprehensively stifled, and Louis Bonaparte had little choice but to defy his brother and relax the blockade in the spring of 1809. This relaxation was applied only to neutral countries, so Louis adhered to the Berlin Decree but not the Milan Decree, which forbade trade with neutral countries. Only neutral ships were allowed in and out of Dutch ports, but there was no guarantee that goods weren't of British provenance. Even prior to this policy shift, Dutch ports had been allowing British vessels to trade under false flags since 1808. Not only was this tolerated, but the Dutch were accommodating to the point of resupplying British ships with food on occasion. Napoleon was furious. He had stripped Holland of external trade opportunities within the empire, but still demanded it uphold the continental blockade. To Napoleon's mind, Louis should have been nothing less than a dutiful brother and a patriotic Frenchman who owed him for placing him on the throne. In a letter addressed to his younger brother in December 1809, Napoleon threatened Holland with annexation unless he instantly ceased trade with Britain, amongst other conditions. Napoleon concluded this letter with a warning that his terms could be brought about either by agreement or by force. The eventual annexation of Holland in June of the following year would have come good on that threat of force, were it not for Louis abandoning his plans to defend Amsterdam at the 11th hour. The King of Holland fled in the face of Marshal Oudinot's occupying army, and Holland was subsumed into the French Empire. Napoleon's response to Holland's disregard of his blockade was not an isolated incident. The threat of annexation or invasion happened several times over the lifetime of the continental blockade. In the 6 months that followed the Berlin Decree, 590,000 tons of illicit British goods entered Hamburg alone. Hamburg and the other Hanseatic cities were annexed by Napoleon in December 1810 as a response to persistent smuggling. Napoleon's application of pressure to allied nations had mixed results. King Frederick VI of Denmark-Norway responded to pressure from France by redoubling his efforts to restrict trade. He did this even though the terms of his alliance with Napoleon prohibited goods from being exported from Denmark-Norway into Hamburg and the broader empire to the nation's financial detriment. Diplomatic pressure worked against smaller client kingdoms as they could be invaded and annexed. Napoleon's diplomatic stumbling block was larger nations like Russia. Tsar Alexander could only be bullied into enduring unfavourable tariffs and trade restrictions up to a point, and was willing to risk the deterioration of diplomacy to the point of war. Threatening smaller nations with military action was an awful lot easier than dealing with the smuggling itself. Smuggling was a mainstay of European trade, and the tactics employed were many and diverse. Bribery was a highly effective tool in a smuggler's arsenal, and could be relied upon to transport contraband right to the heart of the empire. French customs officers were paid a paltry 500 francs per year, so they could be easily motivated to look the other way. It was a common practice for merchant vessels to escape detection by flying whatever flag was most expedient. In a letter written in November 1809, diplomat Sir August Foster assured Richard Saumarez, the British admiral who oversaw the Baltic theatre, that the mere hoisting of a Swedish or neutral flag will be sufficient to ensure the merchant ships the entry of the ports. Some merchant vessels would carry documents that fabricated the provenance of the goods they carried for when a misleading flag didn't suffice. Such tactics were used by smugglers to circumnavigate both British and French blockades. Britain was less affected by false flags and documents though. The Royal Navy was larger, and therefore had a greater capacity to waylay merchant vessels, inspect cargo, and question crew. Once illicit cargo moved inland, it could be concealed in several ways. Louis de Bourrienne was the French consul in Hamburg between 1805 and 1810. He once came across a hole in the ground from which gravel was dug up, ostensibly for the purpose of road repair. Upon repeated visits to this location, he discovered that gravel was being replaced by brown sugar. Another strategy he identified was the concealment of contraband in hearses. A robust strategy, as it doubtless took a brave official to route through a hearse while the funeral procession looked on. Authorities had some success in countering smuggling. Our knowledge of tactics comes from accounts of officials like Bourrienne after all. Nevertheless, smuggling networks existed long before the advent of the continental blockade, and the creativity of merchants poked holes in the embargo of Britain. Napoleon's continental blockade was a bold attempt to hamstring the Royal Navy and the British economy by cutting Britain off from trade with the European mainland. The blockade relied on France's spectacular army to expand the blockade's reach. It also relied on diplomacy to ensure France's allies and client kingdoms adhered to the Berlin and Milan decrees. There was an inherent weakness to this intercontinental cooperation. Napoleon needed every allied country to entirely cease trade with Britain for the blockade to be successful. Conversely, Britain's conventional naval blockade was self-sufficient, relying solely on the strength of its navy. The blockade did interrupt crucial naval supplies from the Baltic in 1807 and 1808, but was too porous to financially cripple Britain over the duration of the conflict. Failure to combat smuggling was a massive weakness of the blockade. Customs officers were easily bought, and the French Imperial Navy wasn't equipped to intercept merchant vessels the way its British counterpart was able to. The worst consequence of the blockade was the strain it placed on the relationship between France and its allies. Napoleon was single-minded in his objective to defeat Britain, and didn't much care if the economies of his allies faltered in the process. This was a contributing factor behind his post-Tilsit allies turning on him. The deterioration of diplomacy led to Napoleon's doomed 1812 invasion of Russia, and France's eventual defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition. We're working on more videos on the economic, social, and other less talked about aspects of military history. To make sure you don't miss them, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would not be possible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.